This is Bekius video number 3. We are on Kuf Amud Aleph and Psachim, 4 lines up from the bottom. The Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Ein halacha lo k'Rab Yehuda v'lo k'Rab Yossi. The halacha, in the situation we discussed last week, does not follow Rabbi Yehuda and does not follow Rabbi Yossi. Just to review, we were talking about a case called Hafsaka, where you start a meal on Erev Shabbos or Erev Yom Tov in a time of day where that's allowed, and that meal continues through the day, through the afternoon until nighttime. There was a machlokas whether you need to stop that meal and start new for Shabbos Yom Tov, or whether you're able to continue the meal into Shabbos Yom Tov. So the Rav Shmuel says here that the halacha does not follow Rabbi Yehuda that said you need to stop, v'lo k'Rabbi Yossi, and it doesn't follow Rabbi Yossi either, who said you can continue. Ella, third opinion, rather, pores mapa umekadesh, that you spread a cloth over the table, and then you make kiddush. Pores mapu mekadesh, what does that accomplish? That does is you're not ending your meal, but you're simply putting a cloth over the table, you're covering everything up to symbolically say that this meal is now pretty much done. Then you make kiddush for Shabbos or Yom Tov. Then you take off the mappa, you take the cloth off the table, and you continue, and then you continue eating your meal in a new Shabbos Yom Tov meal. So you're not really continuing, you're not totally ending, but you're pores mapu mekadesh. You're putting a cloth over the table, symbolically ending meal number 1. You make kiddush, you remove the cloth to symbolically begin meal number 2. So the Gemara says, Aini, is this really true? Does Shmuel really hold like this? Vaha amar Rav Tachlifa bar Avdimi amar Shmuel. But doesn't Rav Tachlifa, the son of Avdimi, say in the name of Shmuel the following idea? Kashem shemafsikin likiddush, just like you were required to end your Friday meal to say kiddush. Turn the page. Kach mafsikin lahavdalah. Kach mafsikin lahavdalah. You're also required to end your meal for Havdalah, meaning on the other side. Let's say you start a meal on Shabbos day, and the meal continues through Shabbos afternoon until the nighttime. So the Shmuel says you need to stop that meal to say Havdalah. So the Gemara says, "My mafsikin." What does it mean to stop the meal for Kiddush or Havdalah? Lav lakiras shulchan. Does this not mean that you're required to actually end the meal? Like get rid of the table, clear off the table, move the table, and start a whole new separate meal? That seems to go against Shmuel saying poris mappa u mekadesh. So the Gemara says no, la mappa. That when Shmuel says end the meal for Kiddush, it means end the meal in terms of just placing the cloth on the table. It does not mean literally end the meal and remove the table, clean the table, and start over. It means simply put the cloth on the table. Rabba bar Avhuna ikal bereish galusa. Rabba, the son of Rav Huna, visited the house of the Reish Galusa. The Reish Galusa was a very important person in the community when the Jewish people were in Bavel. And they came home from shul on Friday night. They were about to have the meal. Aitu taka kame. They brought a table, a mini table that was full of bread before the Reish Galusa to the table, and pores mappa v'kidesh. And what he did was he took a cloth and he covered the table of bread and then recited kiddush. This is because there's a halacha that you're really not supposed to have any food on the table prior to making Kiddush. You're supposed to make Kiddush and then bring all the food afterwards. But here they did that incorrectly. They brought the food to the table already before Kiddush. So what he did was, instead of getting rid of the whole table and clearing it off, he used Poris Mapu Mekadesh as well for this. He put a cloth over the table as if everything was covered, and then he said Kiddush, and they removed the cloth and then ate the meal. Tanya Nami Hachi, it's also taught in the Brisa like this. She'ein mevinas hashulchan. You don't bring food to the table ela im kain kiddush unless you already said kiddush. However, if im hevi, let's say you did bring the food to the table before saying kiddush. So the solution is paresh mapa umikadesh, that you put a cloth over the table, over the food, and then you make kiddush. Back to our discussion between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. Tani Chada, one brisa teaches Shavin she'ein matchilin, that Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda agree in a certain situation that you're not allowed to start a meal. They agree that you're not allowed to start. V'tanya idach, but there's a second brisa that says Shavin she'matchilin, that they agree that you are allowed to start a meal in a certain situation. So one brisa says they agree you cannot start a meal, and the second brisa says that they agree that you can start a meal. So the Gemara now analyzes those two brises. What are those two brises referring to? Bishlama, it makes sense. Hadetanya shavin she'ein matchilin. The brisa that teaches that they agree, they're the same, that you cannot start a meal. How could that be? Because mishkachas la be'erev Pesach. You can find such a situation on Erev Pesach. On Erev Pesach, we learned that Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda both agree that ein matchilin, you cannot start a meal on Erev Pesach. So that brisa that says that they agree that there's a situation where you cannot start a meal, that makes sense. That is good, because that's referring to the situation of Erev Pesach. Ella, rather, hadetanya shavin she'matchilin, rather the brisa that says that they agree in a certain situation that you are allowed to start a meal. Emas. When is that? When do they agree that you're allowed to start a meal? Inema, if you want to say introduction of a Havamina that's going to be rejected, that Erev Shabbos, that maybe they agree that you are allowed to start a meal on Erev Shabbos. No. Ha miflag pligi. They for sure argue that point, because we've been saying up all along that on Erev Shabbos, Rabbi Yehuda holds you cannot start a meal, whereas Rabbi Yossi says you can start a meal on Eve. So it cannot be referring to the case of Erev Shabbos. So what is this last situation talking about? When do Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda agree that you can begin a meal? So the Gemara answers, Lo kashya. It's not a problem, not a difficulty. Kan kodem as tisha, kan la'achar tisha. They agree that you can start a meal on Erev Shabbos or Erev Yom Tov prior to hour 9. But they also agree that after hour 9, you cannot begin a meal. Let me rephrase that last point. Lo kasha, no difficulty. Kan kodem tisha, where the brisa says that they agree, that's referring to Erev Shabbos or Erev Yom Tov before the 9th hour, where even Rabbi Yehuda will agree that you can begin a meal before the 9th hour. But kan la'achar tisha, whereas when the Gemara said that they argue, that's talking about after the 9th hour, where Rabbi Yossi believes you can start a meal, and Rabbi Yehuda says you cannot.